Before I jump right into this week's video, I just want to take a moment and express my sincere gratitude and appreciation for each and every one of you, as my channel has just crossed over 100,000 subscribers. So to all who have subscribed and watched and commented and liked and shared my video, I want to thank you for your unwavering support, as it means more to me than you'll probably ever know. And to celebrate this milestone, I have a giveaway towards the end of this week's video that I'm hoping you might be interested in, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And as far as this week's video goes, I think we can all agree that there's an absolute abundance of information on the web with regards to improving one's landscape photo editing skills. But one thing I think is consistently overlooked has to do with the stage of the process that occurs after the actual photo edit is complete and before the export routine begins. There's so many steps involved in post-processing that sort of build on one another, that impact each other. So for instance, this adjustment will impact this adjustment, and this adjustment could impact that adjustment. And it's real easy to accidentally get tripped up. And in this video, I want to share with you the 5 things that consistently got by me towards the end of my editing workflow, in hopes that this will help improve the overall quality of your post-processing or your photo editing process. I guess you could probably call this something like the post-processing process or something to that effect. So to jump right into it, something that I always struggled with, and I still do from time to time, has to do with the fact that my photo editing process always begins with adjusting exposure. It actually starts with adjusting white balance, and then I adjust exposure. And then when I go on throughout the rest of my process, I'll update my shadows and my highlights next. And as soon as I make the shadow and highlight adjustment, that is going to impact my exposure. And then I will make an update to my white point and my black point. And as soon as I do that, that will also impact my exposure. And then when I add contrast to the photograph or remove contrast from the photograph, that will once again impact the exposure of my image. So by the time I would get to the very end of my actual photo edit, the exposure level was completely different than what it was when I set it in the very beginning. So I ultimately was left with exporting images, sending them to Instagram or posting them on my website, and then reviewing them either a few hours later or maybe a couple days later and realizing that they're all underexposed. And that would happen to me all the time. Every once in a while I'd find some that were under or overexposed, but they would ultimately be very different from what the point was when I set them in the very beginning of the process. So something that helped me to overcome that issue is this. So whenever I would go to export an image, this is a completely edited image, I would come up here and I would switch this to 1:8. It's basically just going to make the image much smaller on my screen and give me a lot of workspace around the actual photograph. And I would right click on the background and change this to black. And then give your eyes a minute or two just to kind of adjust to the overall image now. And then after reviewing the image, you kind of ask yourself, does the image still look properly exposed to you? Does it need to be a little bit brighter? Does it look overexposed, or does it look well exposed now? And then once you've looked at that for a second, you can right click the background again and switch it to white. And then once again, it goes through the same exercise. Does the image still look properly exposed to you? Does it look a little bit too bright? Does it look a little bit too dark? And just going through this process is just kind of a last minute check to determine whether or not you need to make any kind of exposure changes. It's just a very good habit to get into, because it's going to make sure that you haven't change the exposure to a point that is so far away from what you originally set it at. This is just a very great way to look at your overall image with just in a slightly different manner that will help you nail that exposure each time. Now, the next thing that consistently would get me, and this is very similar to the exposure issue, is that I would update my shadows and my highlights very early on in the process, usually after exposure. And then I'd update the white point and the black point, which would also update or also change the way the shadows and the highlights look. And then adding contrast or removing contrast also would change the way the shadows and the highlights looked. So just like exposure, I'd get to the end of my photo editing process and I'd go to export the image, and I would notice that I had clipped shadows or clipped highlights, or basically areas of shadows that are so dark there's no detail, it's just pure black. Or areas of highlights where it's so bright there's no detail, it's just pure white. And it's not, obviously I didn't set it like that when I originally adjusted my highlights and my shadows, but as I went through the overall process, certain adjustments impacted that. So this is something else to get a good habit to get into. Let me change this back to fit, is to just confirm that you don't have any shadows that are clipped or highlights that are clipped by just hitting the shortcut key J. And Lightroom is great for this because anything that is highlighted in blue will basically indicate shadows that are clipped or shadows that are just too dark. And if you want to resolve that, you can easily do that in multiple different ways. You can either increase the exposure a touch, you can increase your shadow recovery a little bit. You could also introduce or go back a little bit on the blacks, brighten up the blacks just a little bit. And as you can see, as we move these back and forth, you can see how it's impacting those areas of clip shadows. And the same thing with the highlights. This is actually the same image, just the base of the waterfall. But anything that's highlighted in red is going to be areas of clipped highlights. So these are basically areas of pure white. There is no detail in these areas right through here. So if we want to resolve that, we can either decrease the overall exposure of the image a little bit, we can decrease our highlights some, we can even bring the whites down a little bit, and all of these adjustments are ultimately resolving all of that area of clipped highlights until the point to where it's gone. So that's a good best practice to get into, something to get used to right at the very end, right before you go through the overall export process. Now, this next one used to get me all the time, and I am happy to say that I pretty much resolved it by doing this or remembering to do this, but I can't tell you how many times to where I would put it, and it's always happened on my website. I'd export an image, put it on my website, maybe a day goes by, maybe a month, or maybe a year, and I'm just looking through my portfolio on my site, and then something catches my eye on an image, and you start looking at it, and you look a little bit closer, and then you realize there's little anomalies in the sky. You can usually see these in the sky, but they're dust spots or sensor spots, or maybe something on your lens. And a lot of times when you're going through your actual editing process, you can't see these, but Lightroom has a fantastic way to help you identify them. So if you just come up here to the spot removal tool and select that, and then you just come down here and hit visualize spots. And then what Lightroom will do is it'll create a black and white version of your image, and it'll enable you to easily see any kind of dust spots on your photograph. And they're so easy to resolve. You just basically adjust the size of the clone tool, and you just click on everything you want to resolve, and it'll make a sample that's nearby and use that to resolve the area. This one right here looks like it's two combined, so I'm going to increase the size of it, click on that, and then I think there's one more right over here, click on that, and that's all you got to do. And just come down here to visualize spots, deselect that, and now all of those spots are going to be removed as soon as my computer catches up and takes these little circles away. Oh, actually I got to hit close, that's why. So, but that's just a great best practice, great to get into the habit of doing that. Because like I said, a lot of times you might not be able to see them, but they are there. So just go ahead and just removing them. And like I said earlier, just kind of giving the image that final polished look is just a great habit to get into. Now, this fourth one, and I feel like this is something that got me for years, and it's mainly because I think I gave Lightroom a little bit too much credit. I would always, when I would remove lens corrections, or whenever I would add the lens corrections to my editing process, that's usually upon import, I would also have remove chromatic aberration also selected. And I just assumed that if I check that box, that Lightroom is going to do its job and remove those chromatic aberrations. But what I found out is that Lightroom really doesn't do a good job by using that method. But when you manually remove it, it is much more powerful. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So for this image right here, if I zoom in, let's change this to 1:4. I'm sorry, not 1:4, 4:1. You'll notice all of this area right through here has bad chromatic aberration, all of this purple fringing all along the trees. And if I come down here to lens corrections, and if I select remove chromatic aberration and select that, you'll notice that it really didn't change anything. All that chromatic aberration is still there. So even though I'm selecting it, nothing's really happening. And for years, I just assumed that it was going to remove it. But what I found is that so many times I would look at exported photos and I would notice this. And you really notice it a lot when you start to realize where chromatic aberration will start to appear in your photographs. And it's usually when you have a bright sky and then you have trees in front of it. You'll notice a lot of times, especially if towards the edges of your photograph, along the branches, you'll see purple or maybe green or blue fringing on those branches. So once you kind of get used to noticing where the chromatic aberration could appear, you start to see it more often. So what I found was coming over here to manual. So not relying on the automatic feature, but just selecting manual, grab this little eyedropper right here and drag this over to an area where the chromatic aberration is really bad. So right here where all that purple fringing is, and just click it. And you'll notice what has already happened. And I'll toggle this on and off. So this is before and after. And if you really look right through here, you can see it. This is before and after, before and after. So as you can tell, that did a substantially more powerful or better job than just using the automatic feature in Lightroom. So I always, right before I go to export a photograph, if there's a situation in that scene where I know that chromatic aberration could be living, I'll go ahead and zoom in, just make sure there isn't any there. And if there is some there, I'll go ahead and use this manual approach to make sure that I resolve for all of that. Now, the very last step of the process is, and this is something that I picked up from Simon Baxter, I believe, last year, and I think it's absolutely an incredible tip. It's something very odd. You would never even expect to do it, but the benefits are really numerous. So ultimately, it's this. So you have your photograph right here. You have to do this in the actual library section. And what you do is you simply just flip your image completely upside down. And when you do that, you don't look at your image the same way. You you now look at your photograph in terms of shapes, as opposed to a grist mill and a waterfall and huge rocks and autumn colors. You're now just looking at just overall shapes in the image. And this is great to kind of confirm composition, make sure that your image is overall balanced the way you want. And it's also fantastic to do some kind of like edge patrol, where you just kind of walk your eyes along the edges of your scene, just to ensure that there's nothing creeping into your photograph that's going to compete for the viewer's attention. Because there's nothing worse than when you export a photograph and you notice that you have boulders that are kind of like half in or half out of your frame, or sticks or twigs, or just things that are cut off on the edges of your scene, because that will always compete for your viewer's attention and ultimately drag the viewer's eye out of your photograph. Here's another example right here where it's a beautiful waterfall. If we flip it upside down, you really don't even see the waterfall anymore. You more or less just see large shapes. And like I said, what I get most out of this exercise is confirming composition, make sure it's the way I like it, and just basically edge patrol to look for those types of anomalies that could be competing for the viewer's attention. So that's kind of the 5-step process that I go through each time now, right before I go to hit the export button. It doesn't take a lot of extra time, but I definitely can guarantee you that it will save time in the long run, so you don't have to do the dance where I always did this with exposure. I'd export it, I realized exposure is too dark. Go ahead and make another adjustment, export it, and look at the image a day later, notice that it's the exposure's off again, and I'd kind of go back and forth and back and forth. So I think this 5-step process is a great way to just put the kind of final polish, the quality assurance, if you will, on your overall photograph before you hit that export button. So I hope that was helpful. Now, as far as the 100K giveaway goes, I thought about this a lot as to what I wanted to do for the giveaway. I knew I wanted to do one. I haven't done one since the channel crossed 50,000 subscribers, and I knew I definitely wanted to do one for 100K. And outside of course, a camera, I couldn't afford to give away cameras, but I thought to myself, what else do outdoor photographers absolutely love besides cameras? And I came up with camera bags. And what photographer doesn't love a good camera bag? So I started kind of noodling on that idea, what would be a good bag? And I started to think one of the most common questions I receive about camera bags has to do with whether or not a specific bag that I'm familiar with is airline compatible. Because when it comes to traveling with camera gear, I think one of the most scary or petrifying things is having to check your camera bag because it's too big to fit on the airplane. So a very common concern is making sure that camera bags are the appropriate size to fit on most airlines. And what I found was, this is the giveaway, the Atlas Athlete Pack is one of the best bags as far as a size perspective goes. This is a 35-liter pack, but it's got a very small footprint, and I have never had an issue traveling with one of these bags ever. It fits in just about every single, I shouldn't say just about, it has fit on every single flight that I've ever taken it on. Large airlines, small airlines, it goes right into the overhead compartment with no issues at all. Tons of space for camera gear, tons of space to put clothes, jackets, anything else, tripods, water bottles, water bladders. It's a great overall pack. And I did a video review on this, I think last year at some point towards the end of last year, which I will link in the description below if you want to take additional or get additional information on this bag as well. So if you are interested in entering the giveaway for this pack, just make sure you are subscribed to the channel, make sure you like this video, and leave me a comment as to why you love landscape photography. Why is landscape photography your genre of choice? And what I'll do is in 2 weeks, I will pick a winner from the comment section below, and I will ship out the Atlas Athlete Pack to you. So I really do hope you hope you enjoyed this week's video, and I do appreciate you watching. As always, any questions, also leave those in the comments section below. And as always, I will see you all next week. Bye.